The sun dipped low over the Sinai Peninsula on a quiet afternoon in October 1973. Israeli soldiers manning the Bar-Lev line watched the shimmering waters of the Suez Canal with a false sense of security. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, and the nation was at a standstill. Suddenly, the silence shattered as thousands of Egyptian artillery pieces roared to life simultaneously. Shells rained down upon the fortifications, while water cannons blasted away the sand berms. This was not merely a border skirmish, but the opening salvo of a coordinated offensive that would shake the Middle East to its very core. The element of surprise was total, and the initial reports reaching Tel Aviv were chaotic and terrifying. Deep within the underground bunkers of the Israeli military headquarters, panic began to set in as the scale of the attack became clear. Syrian tanks were simultaneously storming the Golan Heights in the north, threatening to overrun the sparse defenses. The very existence of the State of Israel seemed to hang in the balance as Arab armies advanced on two fronts. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, usually the symbol of confidence and military prowess, appeared visibly shaken as he surveyed the maps. The seemingly invincible Israeli defense forces were being pushed back, and the specter of a total defeat loomed large. This conflict would not just be about borders, but about the survival of a people who had only recently established their sovereignty. Prime Minister Golda Meir sat in a smoke-filled room, surrounded by her generals and advisors, facing the most critical decisions of her life. She was 75 years old and bore the weight of the entire nation on her shoulders. Despite intelligence warnings that had been dismissed by military leaders, she now had to mobilize the reserves immediately. Her face was etched with exhaustion and worry, yet her resolve remained unbreakable. She ordered a full mobilization and reached out to the United States for urgent assistance. Meir knew that every hour mattered, and that the delay in calling up the reserve units could cost thousands of lives. The fate of the Third Temple, as Dayan called it, rested in her hands. To understand the ferocity of this moment, one must look back to the origins of the struggle in the late 19th century. The Zionist movement emerged in Europe, seeking a homeland for Jewish people fleeing persecution. They looked to their ancestral land in Ottoman Palestine, a territory already inhabited by an Arab population with deep roots in the soil. Tensions simmered for decades under the British Mandate as immigration increased and nationalist aspirations clashed. The United Nations proposed a partition plan in 1947, dividing the land into separate Jewish and Arab states. While Jewish leaders accepted the proposal, Arab leaders rejected it, viewing it as a violation of the rights of the indigenous majority. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion stood beneath a portrait of Theodore Herzl in the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. With a steady voice, he read the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming the establishment of the State of Israel. The joy in the streets was short-lived, for the very next day the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded. The war that followed was a desperate struggle for survival for the new state and a catastrophe, or Nakba, for the Palestinian Arabs. Villages were destroyed and hundreds of thousands became refugees, fleeing their homes amidst the chaos of war. The conflict reshaped the demographics and the map of the region forever. The fighting in 1948 was brutal and often fought at close quarters with improvised weaponry. Jerusalem became the center of a fierce siege, where Jewish convoys tried desperately to break through the blockade to bring food and water to the city. The battles at Latron saw waves of immigrants thrown into combat with little training, facing the well-drilled Arab Legion of Jordan. Despite being outgunned initially, the Israelis managed to secure their borders and even expand beyond the partition lines. By the time armistice agreements were signed in 1949, Israel controlled 78% of mandatory Palestine. The West Bank fell under Jordanian rule, and the Gaza Strip came under Egyptian administration. An uneasy truce settled over the region, but the underlying grievances remained unresolved and festering. The borders, known as the Green Line, were not recognized as permanent boundaries by the Arab states. In Egypt, a charismatic leader named Gamal Abdel Nasser rose to power, championing pan-Arab nationalism. He nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, defying the Western powers and threatening Israeli shipping. This move triggered a secret alliance between Israel, France, and the United Kingdom. In the Sinai campaign, Israel captured the peninsula in a lightning offensive, but was forced to withdraw under heavy pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union. Nasser emerged as a hero of the Arab world. Tensions reached a boiling point once again in the spring of 1967 as rhetoric intensified. Nasser expelled United Nations peacekeepers from the Sinai and closed the Straits of Turin to Israeli shipping. This act was viewed by Israel as a casus belli, or an act of war. Surrounded by hostile armies mobilizing on all borders, the Israeli public felt a sense of impending doom. Parks in Tel Aviv were consecrated as cemeteries in anticipation of mass casualties. However, the military leadership under Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin devised a daring plan. They decided not to wait to be attacked, but to launch a preemptive strike that would change the course of history. On the morning of June 5, 1967, the Israeli Air Force launched Operation Focus. Flying below radar level over the Mediterranean Sea, hundreds of Israeli jets turned south toward Egypt. In a matter of hours, they destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force on the ground, catching them completely by surprise. With air superiority secured, Israeli armor surged across the sands of the Sinai. The speed and precision of the advance stunned the world. Egyptian forces retreated in disarray, losing vast amounts of equipment. The victory in the air had decided the war on the ground before it had truly begun, but the fighting was far from over. Jordan, initially hesitant, was persuaded by false reports of Egyptian victories to join the fray. Jordanian artillery began shelling West Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, prompting an Israeli counterattack. The battle for Jerusalem was fought street by street and house by house. Israeli paratroopers advanced toward the Old City, navigating narrow alleys and ancient stone walls. On June 7, they breached the Lion's Gate and reached the Western Wall. The emotional images of hardened soldiers weeping at the holy site became iconic. Commander Mordechai Gur announced over the radio, "The Temple Mount is in our hands." For the first time in 2,000 years, Jewish sovereignty was restored over their holiest site. In the north, the Syrian army had been using the high ground of the Golan Heights to shell Israeli settlements in the valley below. After dealing with Egypt and Jordan, the Israeli military turned its attention to this formidable natural fortress. Soldiers had to scale steep rocky slopes under heavy fire to dislodge the entrenched Syrian defenders. The fighting was fierce and costly, but within 2 days the plateau was captured. The Six-Day War ended with Israel in control of the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The map of the Middle East had been radically redrawn in less than a week. The swift victory in 1967 led to a period of euphoria and hubris within Israel. Many believed that the Arab states would now be forced to sue for peace in exchange for the return of the captured territories. However, the Arab League met in Khartoum and issued their famous 3 no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with it. A war of attrition ensued along the Suez Canal, characterized by artillery duels and commando raids. For 3 years, static warfare drained the resources and morale of both sides. The deep penetration bombing raids by the Israeli Air Force into Egypt brought the Soviet Union deeper into the conflict. Following the death of Nasser in 1970, Anwar Sadat became the president of Egypt. Sadat was underestimated by both his own people and foreign intelligence agencies, who viewed him as a transitional figure. However, he possessed a strategic mind and a determination to regain the Sinai. He realized that he could not defeat Israel in a total war, but he could launch a limited war to shake the status quo and force diplomatic intervention. He secretly coordinated with Syrian President Hafez al-Assad to launch a 2-front surprise attack. They chose Yom Kippur knowing that Israeli alertness would be at its lowest and the roads would be empty. This brings us back to that fateful afternoon in October 1973 when the surprise was sprung. The intelligence failure in Israel was catastrophic. The concept that the Arabs would not go to war without air superiority blinded the leadership to the obvious signs of preparation. On the Golan Heights, fewer than 200 Israeli tanks faced an onslaught of over 1,000 Syrian tanks. The heroism of individual tank commanders who fought until they were out of ammunition saved the north from total collapse. In the Valley of Tears, a small force held off wave after wave of Syrian armor in one of the greatest tank battles in history. In the south, the situation was equally dire as Egyptian infantry armed with new anti-tank missiles decimated Israeli armor. The mythical invincibility of the Israeli soldier was shattered. It took days for the reserve units to reach the front lines and stabilize the situation. The United States launched Operation Nickel Grass, a massive airlift of weapons and supplies to replace the staggering Israeli losses. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union resupplied the Arab armies. The conflict threatened to escalate into a superpower confrontation. Nuclear forces in the United States were put on high alert as tensions rose between Washington and Moscow. The tide of the war began to turn as Israel mobilized its full strength and adapted its tactics. General Ariel Sharon, a controversial but brilliant field commander, identified a gap between the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies. In a daring move, he led his division across the Suez Canal into Africa. This bold maneuver cut off the supply lines of the Egyptian 3rd Army and encircled them. The road to Cairo lay open, but international pressure mounted to stop the fighting. A ceasefire was imposed, ending the war with Israeli troops deep inside Egyptian and Syrian territory, but at a terrible cost of nearly 3,000 dead Israeli soldiers. The trauma of the Yom Kippur War paved the way for a diplomatic breakthrough that had previously seemed impossible. Anwar Sadat realized that war could not solve the conflict, while Israel realized that military superiority did not guarantee security. In November 1977, Sadat stunned the world by announcing he was willing to visit Jerusalem. Prime Minister Menachem Begin, a hardline leader of the right-wing Likud party, welcomed him. The sight of the Egyptian president speaking at the Knesset in Jerusalem was a moment of surreal hope. It broke the psychological barrier that had existed for decades. President Jimmy Carter invited Begin and Sadat to the presidential retreat at Camp David in September 1978. For 13 days, the leaders engaged in grueling negotiations, often on the verge of collapse. Carter acted as a relentless mediator, shuttling between the cabins. The result was the Camp David Accords, a framework for peace that led to the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty. Israel agreed to withdraw completely from the Sinai Peninsula and dismantle its settlements there. In return, Egypt became the first Arab nation to officially recognize Israel. Sadat paid for this peace with his life, assassinated by extremists in 1981. While peace with Egypt held the northern border with Lebanon became the new flashpoint. The Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, had established a state within a state in southern Lebanon, using it as a base to attack northern Israel. In June 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon in Operation Peace for Galilee. The goal was to push the PLO back and install a friendly government in Beirut. The Israeli army advanced all the way to the Lebanese capital, laying siege to the city. The PLO was eventually forced to evacuate to Tunisia, but the war dragged Israel into a long and muddy quagmire. The Lebanon War damaged the international reputation of Israel, especially after the massacre at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps by Christian Phalangist militias allied with Israel. Although Israeli troops did not commit the killings, a commission of inquiry found Defense Minister Ariel Sharon indirectly responsible for failing to prevent them. The war also saw the rise of a new enemy, Hezbollah, a Shia militia backed by Iran. Israel established a security zone in southern Lebanon, which it occupied for 18 years, facing constant guerrilla warfare and roadside bombs before finally withdrawing unilaterally in the year 2000. In December 1987, a traffic accident in the Gaza Strip sparked a spontaneous uprising known as the First Intifada. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza took to the streets, engaging in civil disobedience strikes and throwing stones at Israeli troops. The images of young boys confronting tanks with rocks shifted global public opinion. The Israeli military, trained for conventional warfare, struggled to deal with a popular uprising. The heavy-handed response failed to quell the unrest. This grassroots movement made it clear that the status quo of occupation was unsustainable and pushed Israeli leadership to seek a political solution. Secret negotiations in Norway led to the Oslo Accords in 1993. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat shook hands on the White House lawn, hosted by President Bill Clinton. The agreement created the Palestinian Authority and outlined a path towards self-governance. It was a time of immense optimism, but also deep division. Extremists on both sides sought to derail the process. Hamas launched suicide bombings in Israeli cities, while a Jewish extremist massacred Palestinians in Hebron. The atmosphere in Israel became toxic, with incitement against Rabin for trading land for peace. On November 4, 1995, the peace process suffered a fatal blow. At the end of a massive peace rally in Tel Aviv, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish ultranationalist who opposed the Oslo Accords. The shock was profound and the political landscape shifted. The subsequent years saw a cycle of failed negotiations and violence. The Camp David summit in 2000 between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat ended without an agreement, leading to the outbreak of the Second Intifada. This uprising was far more violent than the first, characterized by waves of suicide bombings on buses and in cafes. Israel responded to the Second Intifada with Operation Defensive Shield, reoccupying Palestinian cities in the West Bank to dismantle terror networks. In a dramatic shift, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, the architect of the settlement movement, decided to unilaterally disengage from the Gaza Strip in 2005. Israel dismantled all 21 settlements in Gaza and withdrew its military forces. However, instead of peace, the vacuum was filled by Hamas, which eventually took over the Strip in a violent coup. This led to a blockade and repeated rounds of conflict between Israel and Hamas militants. The modern era of the conflict has been defined by asymmetric warfare. Militant groups in Gaza fire rockets indiscriminately into Israeli population centers, while Israel responds with airstrikes and occasional ground incursions. The development of the Iron Dome missile defense system has changed the strategic equation, intercepting thousands of rockets and saving countless lives. Yet the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains dire, and the cycle of violence seems endless. The political divide between the West Bank, governed by Fatah, and Gaza, governed by Hamas, complicates any potential peace efforts. Despite the ongoing stalemate with the Palestinians, the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East continues to evolve. In 2020, the Abraham Accords marked a significant shift as Israel normalized relations with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. These agreements, driven by shared concerns over Iran and economic interests, shattered the consensus that Palestinian statehood was a prerequisite for Arab recognition of Israel. Trade and tourism began to flow between these nations, creating a new axis of cooperation in the region. The story of the Arab-Israeli wars is one of tragedy, courage, and lost opportunities. It is a narrative woven with the threads of ancient claims and modern nationalism. From the kibbutzniks defending their homes in 1948 to the young soldiers manning checkpoints, today the human cost has been immense on all sides. For the Palestinians, the dream of a state remains unfulfilled, while for Israelis the quest for security and acceptance continues. The land remains holy to three faiths, yet soaked in the blood of two peoples destined to share it. Will the sword ever be beaten into plowshares, as the ancient prophets envisioned? The answer remains elusive, buried under layers of mistrust and history. The conflict has transformed from wars between conventional armies to a struggle over identity, legitimacy, and human rights. As new generations rise, they inherit the scars of the past, but also the potential to write a different future. The whisper of time tells us that empires rise and fall, but the land remains, and the people who love it must eventually find a way to live together, or they will surely perish together.